Good afternoon on today's Angry Alien Bulletin. Although you may have seen this footage from the April eclipse quite a number of times if you're a UFO fan, nobody has really tried to draw any sort of connection between the image or shadow or whatever you want to call it that was seen in this footage and some of the other sightings that have been made over the years, either in the sky or in orbit of Oumuamua-like objects. And after a great deal of analysis of not only this footage, but also footage taken on other planets, I've come to the conclusion that there may be another explanation for this footage and others that nobody's really considered. That there may be Oumuamua-like objects lurking everywhere in the solar system, including in low Earth orbit, observable only under very specific circumstances. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon and welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. At this point, a lot of you are probably accusing me of seeing Oumuamua wherever I look when I'm examining UFO photographs and UFO footage, and you might be right, but let me try to explain why. Oumuamua, as near as we can tell, is one of the few, if any, confirmed objects that we have spotted in our solar system that have no natural explanation. And this was an object that was kept under significant observation while it was passing through our solar system. Although, unfortunately, we didn't spot it until it had already made a close approach to our planet. We didn't see it in close proximity to the sun. That in itself was very strange because obviously it wasn't a comet. A comet we definitely would have seen while it was close to the sun because it would have produced a comet-like tail. So it must have been an asteroid, although it didn't behave like an asteroid. It was highly reflective, it tumbled as it moved, and all of those things are fairly typical for at least some asteroids, but what it also did is accelerate on its way out of the solar system. Now, comets occasionally do things like that, although rarely to the extreme that we saw Oumuamua do it, but only through a lot of outgassing. The outgassing required to produce the acceleration that was observed would have required that at least 20% of the object's mass become a gas and produce the acceleration, which is a huge amount and something that was not observed at all, even though Oumuamua is being kept under a very close watch by many of the world's best telescopes. There are many other things about this object that are unusual. I'm not going to rehash it in this video. I have a video linked at the end of this one that covers Oumuamua in much greater detail. But the things we also know about it is that it was very thin, unusually thin, and sort of cigar-shaped, although many theories right now say that it was more of a disc. However, looked at edge-on, that still kind of looks like a cigar, but edge-on also a disc can look like a number of different things, but what it also tends to look like is a shadow that appeared on the surface of Mars, and also an object that was seen in a photo that was taken by a Soviet probe in the 1980s. And all of these things happened as the probe was suddenly going inactive. But if you want to see more details about that incident, well, I have the same video linked at the end of this one, which goes into great detail on that particular incident. But what does this have to do with the imagery that we saw on the day of the eclipse in April of 2024? Well, as you can see, the shadow that we see in this particular footage looks very similar to the shadow that we saw on the surface of Mars. So what does that mean? Could this also, of course, be a shadow from an airplane? Well, I considered that. However, the witnesses who took this footage, and by the way, 2 separate cameras took this footage, and all of the witnesses say that there was no airplane in the sky, there was no jet engine sound, sounds, and anything moving this quickly across the clouds, any shadow moving this quickly across the clouds, could only have been created by a high-altitude aircraft, and a jet aircraft at that, and yet there was no sign of an aircraft that fit that description. And in addition to that, there are no wings on this shadow whatsoever. We definitely see the dark shadow of a fuselage, but let's go ahead and have a look at some actual airplane shadows, quite a number of them actually, and you will definitely see signs of wings on every single one of them, which means the only possibility, if this was indeed an aircraft, was that it would be flying edge on to the observers where the wings would not be visible. But if that was the case, then you would definitely be able to see the tail. And by the way, the little halos that you're seeing around a lot of these shadow images are an atmospheric phenomenon called a glory. In itself, a spectacular thing to observe, but of course, we don't see that in this footage either. So if this isn't an airplane, and it isn't a helicopter, first of all, would have a very hard time flying at that altitude, wouldn't have been able to go that fast either to produce a shadow moving that quickly across the clouds. So what else could it possibly be? Once again, we need to go back to our shadow on the surface of Mars. But instead of looking at that particular shadow, let us instead look at this shadow. Now, this shadow was definitely produced by an object in Mars orbit. It is, in fact, the shadow of the moon Phobos, captured by the Mars Express orbiter. By the way, Mars Express orbits a little bit outside the orbit of Phobos, which incidentally orbits very close to Mars. We're only talking a few thousand kilometers away, and it orbits the planet nearly twice each day. It is a very low-flying and very, very fast moon in comparison to our natural satellite, and it casts these shadows across the surface of Mars on a very regular basis. And not only do these shadows appear, but they also move very rapidly across the surface of Mars. It is an amazing coincidence and a lucky break every time Mars Express captures these things, because these shadows move across the surface of the red planet at about 7,000 kilometers per hour, reflecting the incredible orbital speed of this little moon. Now, bear with me for just a moment. Let us imagine that there is a spacecraft, a disc-shaped or cylindrical spacecraft that is hiding in the sun's glare in order to avoid detection. And let us further assume that on the occasion that the moon's shadow passes over a particular spot, the shadow of this object, if it is in Earth's orbit, might also pass over the same location at roughly the same speed, although this time the speed is regulated by the rotational velocity of the Earth rather than the orbital speed of the moon, anywhere from 1,770 kilometers per hour at the equator all the way to a mind-bending 8,046 kilometers per hour at the poles. So it would be interesting to have somebody who's an expert in these kinds of things to estimate the velocity of the shadow, at least based on the visual evidence that we have at our disposal, to see exactly how fast it is moving across the sky, and then compare that figure to how fast the moon shadow should have been moving across the face of Texas at that moment as the eclipse was taking place. Once again, I am not nearly the mathematical genius that it would take to make those kinds of calculations, but it would be a very interesting exercise to engage in my opinion. But all of this is, of course, wild speculation. There's no evidence whatsoever of a disc or cigar-shaped craft sitting around in low Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit, or any orbit that would allow it to take advantage of the brilliance of the sun and to conceal itself from our telescopes and other methods of detecting it until this convenient eclipse came along, right? Right? Well, not exactly. After researching this for quite some time, I came across this footage, which a sharp-eyed observer noticed a decade ago from the International Space Station. And you will notice this cigar-shaped image appearing over the disk of the Earth. And if you think it's a cloud or something like that, well, it isn't. The orbital path of the ISS takes it over the Earth's surface. You can see the clouds moving, and yet this cylindrical shaped object remains motionless, as if it's in orbit in sync with the ISS. Once again, that doesn't correspond to an orbit that would keep it within the glare of the sun, but who's to say that whatever this craft is, assuming that it hangs around all the time, is always going to take advantage of the sun. And interestingly enough, this footage was only visible for about 1.5 minutes, and then NASA cut the feed for reasons that they still haven't explained. And in case you still think I'm seeing things when it comes to strange shadowy objects zooming across the heavens, well, have a look at this 2022 footage taken at a South Korean golf event of some kind, and they just happened to be filming this when all of a sudden whatever the hell this was absolutely zoomed across the heavens at colossal speed. Once again, I would be very interested to know what the orbital speed of a shadow might be if it were traveling across the face of the Earth at South Korea's latitude. Although if you have another look at this image, you'll see that the sky is completely overcast, that there's no way anything's casting a visible shadow on the upper deck of the clouds, and that's going to be visible to anyone. Whatever this was, it had to actually be below the clouds, and again traveling at enormous velocities, perhaps an insect of some kind. But once again, the trajectory, it just held a really straight line, as if it were a plane, a missile, or something else. But the more I look into all of this, the more footage I look at, the more photographs I see, the more I see a pattern developing, the more I see the same shape being repeated over and over again, not just on Earth, but throughout the solar system. This series of images, which I've shown you before, taken by the Curiosity rover, then of course the shadow on the surface of Mars taken by the Soviet Phobos probe, it just goes on and on and on. Either disc or cigar-shaped object after disc or cigar-shaped object. And that's what I want to look for when we're talking about visitors from another civilization. It makes very little sense to me that another civilization would send one odd type of spacecraft after another to pay us a visit. I can see perhaps a larger disc or cigar-shaped object being a mothership of some kind, and then small spherical scout craft, and perhaps even the Tic Tac craft, although those have only been seen once, although perhaps on another occasion based on observation made on radar, but we can't say for certain. Regardless, what I like to see is some consistency, because even though an alien civilization might design an entirely different spacecraft every single time, and who knows, maybe they like uniqueness. It's impossible to say how another species might think. It's really nice and reassuring to see the same design over and over again. And there seems to be an increasing amount of evidence to indicate that. Not that anybody in the scientific community or over at NASA is going to admit it. In the midst of all of this investigating, I also came across a 1996 clip which people thought was a UFO flying around in front of the space shuttle cameras. But Thomas Jones, a former shuttle mission specialist and payload commander and co-author of Planetology, Unlocking the Secrets of the Solar System, who was on that mission, provided provided this description of the footage: a few ice crystals or flakes of thruster residue in the near field are floating by and get hit by a thruster exhaust plume and then zip out of the seam, which I think is a very likely explanation. And then another astronaut named Mario Runco, who was on another mysterious mission that had some images that I'm not going to show you right now because I think they have a logical explanation as well, but he also made a statement that kind of irritates me about UFO sightings in general. Quote, "If I thought it was an intelligent craft, I'd be the first to speak up. I'd want the credit. Mario Runco was the first person in history to conclusively document the existence of an extraterrestrial civilization. Why would I ever want to keep it a secret?" Unquote. Well, I'll tell you why, Mr. Runco, because if you're not 100% certain and you don't have completely convincing proof, and I'm talking Independence Day level imagery of spacecraft flying right up to the shuttle, you're not going to convince most people. You're especially not going to convince your colleagues, and you're going to ruin your entire career, as most astronauts who have talked about UFOs have successfully done to themselves in the past. That's why you would keep it a secret. And even if you do manage to get high quality imagery of something that definitely looks like a flying saucer, people are just going to accuse you of using CGI to cook the whole thing up. Just like people back in the 1960s, the few who got really fantastic photographs of UFOs, well, they were simply accused of tossing hubcaps through the forest and taking pictures of them. That being the case then, until we have a full-blown mass sighting in front of thousands of people that is documented by hundreds of cell phone cameras, which I think is possible given the Phoenix Lights incident, I don't think we are ever going to have an end to this mystery or acceptance on the part of the scientific community, which in my opinion is a very disappointing thing. But in the meantime, all we can do is look for more evidence and look for more patterns in the evidence that we find, and then make sure people know about it. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, I just released my next Patreon exclusive video, this one about whether or not Barnard's star might be a UFO base, and some interesting information about that star that a lot of people don't know about. So if you'd like to check all of that out, details in the description, and in the meantime, stay angry about space.